On this particular journey, we had a troubling incident involving one of Mr. Bennett's ox drivers, Silas Helmer. He fell ill with a life-threatening bowel complication which left us in a state of great concern. Days passed, and it seemed as though his condition would not improve, but to our relief he eventually made a full recovery. However, that was not the only moment of worry we encountered on this trek. As we reached the Smith Trail, there was a sense of tension in the air. As the teams turned right, it became apparent that not everyone was following the original plan. Captain Hunt came and bid us farewell, and my companion Bennett and his group broke away to follow the Smith party. It was a significant moment as we parted ways, and little did we know that our path would soon lead us near the tragic event that occurred at Mountain Meadows, orchestrated by the Mormon generals. As we ventured through the hills, our route upwards was a pleasant one. We found ample wood, water, and grass along the way. Eventually, we reached what appeared to be the summit of a mighty mountain, 3 days' journey on the new trail. There were groups of juniper trees which signaled that we had reached elevated terrain. Before us was a rocky canyon that proved impossible for wagons to cross. The explorers we sent out to find a passable route returned with the disappointing news that no adequate passage could be found for wagons. While there was wood and grass aplenty, water was far off, and we had to carry it up to our campsite. It was decided that we would camp here while we continued to explore the area for an alternate route. After 2 days of searching, we realized that the west side of the canyon was passable, but it would take years to make it suitable for wagons. The excitement over the Smith cutoff had faded away, and talk of retracing Hunt's path had taken its place. On the third morning, a lone traveler who was seeking to regain his health passed away. Though his name escapes my memory, some folks were very active about his wagon, while others believed too much attention was paid to a stranger. Nevertheless, the men of the company gave him a decent burial, but things took a dramatic turn when Mr. Rynierson spoke up about their predicament. He reminded everyone that winter was upon them, and the snow could fall at any moment. He highlighted the dangers of staying where they were and urged everyone to seek another way. Without hesitation, he hitched up his oxen and led the charge back to the old trail. His firm decision galvanized many others, and soon enough a respectable train had fallen in behind him. As hunters returned with reports of no road available, they too yoked up their oxen and rolled out. Some waited for their companions still out in the fields, and soon all were about ready to move. Just as they were preparing to move out, a party arrived with news that the pass was found, and no trouble lay ahead. This good news convinced the owners of 27 wagons to travel on westward, rather than return to the old trail. As my comrade, Mr. Bennett, and I journeyed forth, fate had other plans in store for us. The axle of his wagon shattered into splinters, sending us careening back to camp. We scavenged an axle from a wagon belonging to a man who was no longer with us. By the time we had it fitted to our own wagon, night had fallen upon us. We had no choice but to wait until morning. A few others had yet to begin their journey, and they camped with us for the night. Among them were J.B. Arcane, his wife and child, 2 Earhart brothers and their sons, and a handful of other wagons. When daybreak finally arrived and all was ready, we followed the trail left by those who had journeyed ahead. At first, we headed north in search of a pass. Of the Green River party, only Mr. Rogers and I remained with our group. After some time, we called a meeting to get organized and travel systematically. However, there was a palpable sensation that those without families were less inclined to help those with wives and children in their party. This feeling created a fair amount of debate, which ultimately resulted in the family wagons being left out of the arrangements. As we journeyed forth, a group calling themselves the Jayhawkers passed us by. We trailed after them, rolling over rolling hills covered with juniper timber and small grassy valleys. Those before us had already broken out the road, making our journey quite pleasant. During the organization meeting, Jim Martin was appointed the captain. Reverend J.W. Breyer, along with his family, J.B. Arcane and his family, and Mr. A. Bennett and his family were rejected from joining the group. Mr. Breyer refused to stay behind and forced himself upon us, insisting that he was coming along, which he did. However, the other families remained behind. Though I heard what was said at the meeting, I had a long-standing friendship with Mr. Bennett, who had been faithful to me and my property even when I was absent. I decided to stay with him and his wife, no matter the consequence. I took advantage of not having a team to drive by exploring the mountains along our route, venturing even miles away from the trail to reach the highest ascents. Sometimes I would spend the night out there. Using Mr. Arcane's field glass, I was able to take in all the breathtaking views the land had to offer. However, I soon became aware that heading north was not getting us closer to our destination. Despite my repeated warnings, my travel companions persisted in their misguided direction. I informed the leaders that we were moving back towards Salt Lake instead of California, but they insisted that they were following the mountaineer Williams's route and had not yet reached his northernmost point. I told them and Mr. Bennett that we had to either retrace our steps or turn west to get back on the regular Los Angeles road. Following a morning meeting, we all agreed to turn westward and leave behind our previous path. We changed our direction by nearly 90 degrees and broke our own trail across a tableland that gave us little difficulty. When we made camp, the oxen seemed to take a liking to a white weed that was abundant, causing some concern that it may be toxic. Come to find out, the plant was the nutritious white sage that cattle eat freely with no adverse effects. We crossed a small creek flowing south and a low range that had small springs and evidence of Indian corn harvesting. Strange sandstone pillars that were 15 feet tall and slender stuck out in several areas. The next patch of tableland declined towards the east and had an abundance of sage and bunch grass that was a foot tall and had seeds resembling broomcorn seeds. The Indians had gathered the grass and piled them in 100-pound heaps to utilize for food, which I discovered on examining their camps. One day I climbed up a high mountain that had some pine in order to see the surrounding area. As I approached the mountain's base, I heard a pounding sound that ceased when I came near it. The flat rock was about 50 feet square and had many signs of camps, such as pine burrs and animal bones scattered across and around the rock. In the middle there was a small rectangular stone that fitted securely into a hole. I removed the stone and found that it covered a small well of water, about 3 feet deep, that had been protected from unfortunate small animal drownings. When I finally made it to the mountain top, I witnessed that the land westward looked increasingly barren. On the second night, the brave Jayhawkers finally appeared in our rear. They had finally taken my advice and rushed along our road with great speed. We set up camp together that night, and the next morning they once again led the way. After crossing a small range, we came upon a barren basin with no apparent way out. As some of the boys trekked ahead of the teams, they discovered a group of Indians following behind them out of bow and arrow range. The boys hastened their pace, fearing an impending attack. The Indians vanished as soon as the boys reached the wagons, with no trace left behind except for a lone prairie wolf-like dog. We camped by a small mountain where the cattle could graze upon the grass in the basin, but all we had to drink was the water in our kegs. A few of the boys climbed the northern side of the mountain and found no springs along their way. As they descended the canyon, they found a small pool of rainwater in the rocks, and all eagerly took a drink. Lew West even lay down and drank until he couldn't any longer, saying he had never felt so good. But their pleasure was short-lived, as the small pool quickly ran dry. As they continued down the canyon, they saw an Indian swiftly dodge behind some rocks. After searching, they found him unconscious in a cave. They yanked him out of the dirt and marched him along, pestering him for information on the whereabouts of Owens Lake, which they had been assured was on their desired path. But the poor sap was about as useful as a wet noodle, and they eventually dragged him back to their camp. There they decked him out in a bright red shirt to conceal his indecency, and sandwiched him betwixt two white blokes to prevent an escape. Come morning, they made some headway with the guy, and he pointed them towards a nearby stream 4 miles out, supplying enough water to meet their needs. They set up shop near the water source while the boys and their Indian comrades scaled a rocky, waterless mountain. But lo and behold, the Indian led them to a small watering hole on a cliff face, a spot so stealthy that only a native would think to check it out. They guzzled the life-sustaining liquid and even offered some to their newfound friend. But he refused to partake in such a civilized manner, opting to take his fill straight from the pool. As the boys gazed dreamily at distant peaks and babbled about their prospects, they were jolted back to reality by the sound of their Indian pal skittering down the cliffs like a mountain goat. In just a few bounds he vanished from sight, leaving them with only his bow and arrows to remember him by. They had hoped for his assistance in finding Owen's Lake, but were now left with nothing but their own limited knowledge. Game became more and more scarce with each passing day, to the point where the men no longer thought it necessary to tote their heavy firearms. The arid mountains and valleys proved increasingly barren, and water sources dwindled to a mere trickle. Nonetheless, the party soldiered on with all due haste. Water was a precious commodity in this barren land. We found it in holes at the bottom of canyons or in small pools that had collected rainwater from higher ground. But for days, not a single drop of rain had fallen on us. In fact, each night the sky was clear and warm. The elevated parts of the land were made up of isolated buttes with no running streams, but instead dry lakes with smooth, light-colored clay beds. These beds were so hard that even the track of an ox couldn't be seen on their glittering surface. From a distance, these clay beds shimmered like water in the sun, deceiving us into thinking they were actual bodies of water. The illusion was so perfect that it almost led us to ruin on a couple of occasions. To get a better view of the country north and west, I took Arcane's field glass and climbed all the high buttes within a day's walk of the road. Sometimes I would be gone for 2 or 3 days with no luggage except my canteen and gun. I took great care to avoid surprises from the Indians and always stayed on the safe side of caution. At nightfall, I would build a fire and then travel on until I found a small washed-out place where I could lie down and stay till morning. This way, if any Indians stumbled upon my fire, they wouldn't find anyone to attack. One day, as I was hiking up a wide ravine that led to the summit, I saw smoke curling up before me. I took a side ravine and approached cautiously, keeping my head low so as not to be seen. When I was near the top of the ridge, about 100 yards from the fire, I risked raising my head slowly to see how many people were in the camp. I spotted 2 individuals, and as I looked across the ravine, an Indian woman seemed to be looking back at me, but luckily she could only see the top of my head. I quickly sank back down out of sight. Crawling up the slope, I aimed to get a clearer look at the landscape. As I stood upright, a woman spotted me. She snatched up her baby from its simple pallet, a piece of wood covered with a rabbit pelt, and tucked the child under her arm. The woman yanked the arm of a little girl who cried loudly and dashed up the gentle rise to its top. The girl chased after her. The woman's tresses, black as night, flew out behind her as she darted to and fro, casting furtive glances at me over her shoulder. She seemed poised to fight or flee. This wild, untamed mother, with her children in tow and no concern for fashion or anything else, was the most captivating scene I'd ever witnessed. I doubt any artist could capture the primal beauty of the moment the way it played out before me. As the family vanished over the summit, I followed in their footsteps until I reached the very top. There was no one in sight. I surveyed the terrain through my looking-glass. To the north, the land was dark and mountainous. I deliberated for some time, but resolved not to venture in that direction. The risk of ambush by Indian tribes loomed large, and we'd seen signs of them daily. None of them had made unwanted visits to our camp, but that didn't guarantee friendly intentions. After my decision not to proceed north, I checked out the Indian woman's encampment. Her only source of warmth was a small smoking fire. I perused her conical basket, finding only a handful of inadequate arrows and cactus leaves stripped of their spines by fire. Nearby rested the makeshift bed, consisting of the wooden plank covered with a rabbit fur blanket where the infant had been sleeping. The atmosphere was bleak and unwelcoming to anyone craving sustenance. Eager to scout out the surrounding area, I scrambled up a high butte, scanning the landscape with great care, taking particular note of the west and north. The sight before me was bleak and barren. No trees, no fertile valleys, no greenery. In the distance I spied a chain of mountains coated with bright powdery snow. That, I concluded, should be our destination point. Other than that, no traces of snow were visible, except for a black rocky formation stretching between myself and the snow-topped mountains. I also noted a wide, flat plain, lacking any apparent signs of water based on what we'd experienced so far on our trek. To my right and northwest, the terrain seemed volcanic, black and lifeless. As I gazed out into the vast expanse before me, it dawned on me that we were much further from a fertile land than what our comrades had been led to believe. Many of them had read Fremont's accounts of his travels and thought that the mountains were a quick gateway to the green pastures of California. They believed that the snowy range ahead was the last obstacle before the long-awaited destination. However, as I explained to them, and as they soon discovered for themselves, this was not the case. Our path had taken us through a winding route amongst the buttes that resembled Indian baskets turned upside down on the vast and barren plain. We stumbled upon small pools of water in washout areas near the foothills at the valley's edge, likely from the runoff of a recent storm. However, dry lake beds were scattered throughout the plain, and it was clear that there had not been enough water in recent times for these lakes to form. These lakes looked almost identical, with their white and glistening beds that made it difficult to see, and any tracks left on their surface were quickly erased. It seemed as if the once smooth bed of the mortar had now solidified in the sun. There was no sign of water or clouds. The weather was clear every day and incredibly warm during the daytime, with starry skies at night. The poor quality of grass poses an ever-present challenge to our oxen. As we unyoke them and let them graze, they appear uninterested in the sparse vegetation. They move slowly and graze on whatever shrubs or grass clumps they can find, which is usually only 6 inches to a foot high, which makes us anxiously wonder when the next moment a good meal will come our way. The faithful animals that had accompanied us on our journey were now mere shadows of their former selves. Skinny, weak, and lacking in vitality, they straggled behind, doing their duty until the last possible moment. We ate dry food and drank no water, leaving us in a state of constant fear and apprehension. We began to wonder how long it would be before we would have to kill them for sustenance. As we traveled further down the broad ravine, it became apparent that the mountain range was perpetually on our southern border, and the northern landscape was dotted with buttes and dry lakes, offering little in the way of salvation. Despite being an experienced hunter, I had only managed to kill a single rabbit, which left me ravenous in the absence of any other type of game. Hunger was a constant companion throughout our journey. It was only when we happened upon a towering butte, situated some 20 miles south of our current route, that I decided to take matters into my own hands. I was determined to climb it and glean a better view of our surroundings. After a day of relentless walking, I reached the summit at dusk, eager to explore its rugged terrain. As I wandered among the Goliath boulders on the mountaintop, I chanced upon a cliff which provided the perfect shelter from any environmental threat that might come my way. Here, in undisturbed solitude, I made camp. A fire was required, so I gathered sage and other small shrubs to use as fuel. As I sat close to the warm flames, I meditated on our plight, and I saw darkness looming on the horizon. I found myself exhausted and in need of rest, so I settled down for the night. With a stone for a pillow and my hat as a cushion, I lay down close to the overhanging rock. However, the cold soon awoke me from my slumber. The butte I had chosen was quite high, and the temperature had dropped significantly during the night. I stoked the fire with little sticks so that it would keep me warm, and remained there in solitude, surrounded by the barren landscape. As the first light of day broke across the eastern mountains, I felt some relief. I surveyed the situation and realized that I could see nearly everything around me. To the north and west lay a vast, level plain, which appeared to stretch for 100 miles without interruption. I could see no signs of water or vegetation anywhere in sight. This plain was bounded on the western edge by a low, black, and rocky range that extended far to the north and south. There was apparently no way to pass through it, and beyond lay another range parallel to it. On the other side of this lay the high peak we had been seeking for nearly a month. We had named it Martin's Pass, and it was the lowest point on the north side. The peak was covered in shimmering snow that glistened brilliantly in the early morning light. The air was clear without a hint of cloud cover, dust, or haze to obscure the view, making it seem as if the peak was within touching distance. However, I knew from experience that this couldn't be true. In the past, objects that appeared close by in such weather conditions turned out to be a day's walk away. Clear lakes that looked just over a small hill were often much farther than anticipated, which meant that we had to learn how to look for water in a particularly unique way. While in Wisconsin, I'd learned that I needed to venture into ravines to find fresh water. Up here we had to move upwards into the high mountains because that's where the water was. Hopelessness loomed over me like a dark cloud. I longed to escape the responsibilities that bound me to the women and children who could not fend for themselves. If I were on my own, I could easily gather my belongings and venture off without any apprehension, leaving no dependents behind. But alas, I had a moral obligation to stay with Mr. Bennet's wife and children, as well as Mr. Arcane's family, with whom I had formed a bond. It was a somber thought, but standing by my friends and their loved ones, no matter the cost, was a duty I could never shirk. Using my spyglass, I watched as the wagons slowly made their way across the plains, heading towards what appeared to be a vast body of water. After estimating where they would rest for the night, I charted a straight course towards the destination, hoping to arrive before nightfall. However, my efforts were in vain as darkness descended before I could reach the campfires. Still, I persisted and continued onward, finally stumbling upon a muddy patch which was a positive sign of water nearby. In the pitch black of night, I searched for a source and eventually came upon a small pool. Desperate, I drank greedily from it, despite its murky appearance. The next day, I discovered that the pool had been used to water the oxen, and it was already mostly drained. The livestock had stirred up the sediment, leaving behind a few inches of muddy liquid. Unappetizing as it was still vital to our survival. At the campsite, I found the rest of the group by the lake, which had only a shallow amount of water, barely above a quarter-inch. Thankfully, they had dug some makeshift wells, which were now filled to the brim with water. It was a relief to have a source of hydration so readily available in such desolate terrain. The more adventurous climbers in our party had abandoned their pursuits by this point, leaving me to scout out the path ahead. I had my hands full trying to scavenge enough food for the oxen and find water for the group. Even worse, we knew that there were Native Americans lurking in the area, waiting to pounce on any unsuspecting travelers. It was a precarious situation, but I was determined to see our journey through, no matter the obstacles we faced. There were signs aplenty, and my eyes had to be wide open to stay ahead of them. That night, as soon as word spread that I was in the vicinity, folks came clamoring to our wagons, desperate to know what I'd seen, what I'd learned, and what lay in store for us down the road. More than anything, they wanted to know how much longer it could possibly be before we reached our destination. I heard their questions and spoke my mind as best I could, without letting on how dire things were starting to look. They seemed to take my words to heart and trusted my judgment completely when I ventured that it would be at least another month before we came much closer to our goal. They frowned at that, but I could tell they knew I was right. It wasn't hard to see the toll this arduous journey was taking on our oxen and supplies. At the crack of dawn, I was already up and about, taking stock of things. That's when Mr. Bennet, one of the folks we were traveling with, pulled me aside and spoke his mind. "Lewis," he said with a serious glint in his eye, "let me be straight with you. I'd rather you kept your opinions to yourself from now on. Last night, when Sarah heard what you had to say, she was near tears. She trusts your judgment, and if you say the outlook is bleak, she thinks we all might as well give up right here and now." As day broke, some of the more reckless members of our caravan hitched up and headed west across a flat, barren plain that I had already warned was devoid of life-giving water. It pained me to watch them go, knowing full well what awaited them. Mr. Culverwell and Mr. Fish, however, had made the wiser decision to stick with our group. We huddled together and debated the situation, ultimately agreeing that it would take at least 4 or 6 days to cross that wasteland, if it was even possible at all. It didn't bode well that we knew there wasn't a single drop of water to be found along the way. To the south, a mighty mountain stood tall, its summit covered in a considerable amount of snow. Its base hosted some small pine trees, and without a doubt there was plenty of water flowing nearby. However, our journey was not meant to take us in that direction, for it was quite off our intended course. Despite this, the chances of finding water there were greater than following the jayhawkers on their long, tiring trek over the dry, desolate plain. As we turned up a canyon leading towards the mountain, we found ourselves struggling with a rocky, uneven path and a steep incline. Midway through the ascent, we encountered a high cliff with numerous niches or cavities embedded into its face. These were as large as barrels, and in some of them we discovered balls of glistening substance resembling variegated candy stuck together. These balls were immense, equal in size to small pumpkins, and are evidently some kind of food source. When hunger got the best of us, we all tasted it, finding it sweet but altogether sickening. Some even felt nauseous after ingesting it, but despite our hunger, I felt it best not to disturb the Indians' food. For the natives to cross and survive in such a harsh and lifeless country meant they must be wise, and we could count them as hostiles, as they were nowhere to be seen around our camp. As with any other Indian tribe, they were likely to be vengeful and might seek to hurt us in return, causing us harm as we travel. We spent our second night near the canyon's head, but until now we had not caught sight of any water or vegetation for our oxen. The only plant these poor beasts found were some stunted sagebrush, and they didn't seem inclined to take more than a nibble. They lingered near the camp, looking mournful and dismal as they tried to take refuge from the biting cold. During the night, a stray and erratic-looking cloud wafted by, leaving its moisture on the mountain, forming a thick layer of snow several inches deep. The next morning, as the day dawned on us, the oxen, shivering with cold, crowded around the wagons, eagerly licking the snow to quench their thirst. We followed their lead, slowly melting the snow in search of water, hoping for better luck in the days to come. Our cattle were a sorry sight, and it appeared as if they couldn't carry much weight. We knew we had to take it slow and steady on the uphill climb. Luckily, one member of our group, Mr. Bennett, was a skilled carpenter and had brought along his trusty tools. We persuaded him to unload them, along with most of our supplies, leaving just our bedding and provisions in the wagons. With lighter loads, we began our journey up the mountain. My companion Rogers and I took the lead, keeping our guns close by in case of danger. As we trekked through the snow and up the incline, we could see the mountain's snowy peak in the distance. We were determined to reach it by nightfall. No guide was necessary at this point, so we moved as quickly as possible, searching for the perfect camping area. We agreed to signal our comrades with smoke once we found a suitable spot. However, our estimate of distance was once again proved wrong. We continued marching until the sun began to set, and we finally arrived at a flat plateau. A small brush hut with a fire nearby came into view. From our vantage point, we could see that only a few people occupied the area. We approached carefully, expecting potential danger. After circling around, we discovered the entrance to the hut and crept up to it, remaining vigilant. At last, a man's head appeared in the doorway. We held our guns tightly, but retreated a bit when he quickly retreated back inside. Slowly, we advanced, keeping our guns at full cock in readiness. We cautiously walked towards the hut, ready for any imminent danger. Suddenly, the man emerged once again, almost naked, and signaling us to come forward. We were relieved to see that they were friendly, and we hoped they could offer us information about the surrounding area. We were, after all, hopelessly lost. We attempted to communicate with the man using sign language, but it seemed to be as effective as talking to an oyster. In a last-ditch effort, I dug a small basin in the ground and filled it with water from our canteens to mimic a lake. I gestured west and north while imitating the flight and sounds of ducks and geese. But alas, our efforts seemed fruitless, as the man didn't seem to comprehend our intentions. I grew more and more irritated the longer our interaction lasted. Amidst it all, the children in the hut cried out fearfully, seemingly under the impression that we would kill them all. Under other circumstances, we could have easily lost our scalps in a situation like this. However, we were well armed, and the man seemed to lack any weapons. As such, we felt no fear whatsoever. The man shivered with cold, and to show him that we meant him no harm, we fired off one of our guns. The noise caused him to stir, and he pointed to the gun and said, "Walker." I assume he was referring to the good Chief Walker, who had helped us along our journey down Green River. The man made it evident that he was not friendly with Walker, but he brought out a handful of corn to show his good intentions towards us. He had cultivated it from the aid of a warm spring nearby, and the dry stalks stood around him as evidence. Before we took our leave, I promised to come back the next day with clothes for the man if we could find any. With that, we returned to our wagons, keeping our eyes peeled for any unwanted guests. We returned to the camp to find it in a sorry state. The mothers were highly distressed, with the children crying out of thirst for water. We took pity on them, presented them with full canteens of water, and they blessed us for our generosity. The journey was hard on the oxen. The ground they trod was nothing but broken stones and dry, stunted brushes which barely reached 6 inches high. They had to make do with a mouthful of the foliage every now and then, but it was hardly enough to sustain them. Despite the challenges, we pushed on towards the warm spring, thankfully only 7 or 8 miles away. We made an early start, and even the women walked, hoping to ease the load on the poor beasts. But as we drew closer to the water source, some of the oxen collapsed, drained of all energy. We had no choice but to leave them behind, along with a wagon, and continue on foot. It wasn't long before the rest of us reached the spring, where we quenched our thirst and took a breather. We then retraced our steps to our stranded oxen and gave them water. They were somewhat rested and were able to muster the strength to continue, especially when we hitched them to the wagon, working together in unison. The warm spring was an oasis in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by crops of dry cornstalks, small willows, sagebrush, weeds, and grass. The oxen feasted on this smorgasbord, their first proper meal in a long while. We decided to stay for a while, at least 2 or 3 days, to give the oxen some much-needed rest. We weren't alone. An Indian who we left behind the previous evening to keep guard was gone, leaving only a chunk of crystallized rock salt behind. It was strange, but it soon became clear that he had his reasons or fears. As we took in our surroundings, we noticed that the range we had been traversing seemed to come to an end where a snow peak stood, and that there were lower passes to the north and south of the said peak. We eventually decided to scale the summit of the pass, only to discover the tracks of our runaway Indian in the snow, passing over a low ridge. As we trudged uphill, our boys started to lag behind, and well before nightfall they were out of sight. The ground underneath us was soft and unsound, and I spotted many tracks from Indian tribes that put me on my guard. By the time I reached the top, the mountain's shadow had cast a veil of dim light over the surroundings. I constructed a fire out of the sagebrush, consumed my provisions, and once darkness had truly set in, I rekindled the fire and trekked for an additional mile. There was a small 2-foot ravine that I hunkered down in, shielded from the wind, where I slept until dawn. This was in order to outdo the Indians by using their own conventional tactics against them. The next morning I arrived at the summit around 9 o'clock and gazed upon the most majestic landscape I had ever seen. I could see from north to south untold distances. The contiguous region appeared lower, but most of it seemed to be made up of desolate, arid, mountainous terrain. Towards the west, a snow-capped peak obstructed the scenery in that direction. To the south, it seemed as though the mountains ascended for more than 20 miles, and situated about 10 miles away from the base I saw several plumes of smoke, apparently from campfires. Seeing no wildlife or campsite carts anywhere, I surmised that the originators of these fires must have been Indians. North and east of my position, a few miles away, was the most uneven and hilly terrain I had ever come across. It was surrounded by sharp peaks and boasted a multitude of colors, with some of them having a reddish hue that made the mountain appear to be crimson-colored with heat. I figured it was a true volcanic hotspot, and this was the closest I had ever been to one. It was the most amazing spectacle of vast desolation that anyone could ever witness. Looking towards the north, I could discern the desert that the jayhawkers and their comrades had ventured to traverse. If their voyage was as vexatious as ours and lasted a great deal longer, they might by now be lifeless from dehydration. I perched myself on top of this summit for quite an hour, my glass trained in all directions within my eye-shot, minutely scrutinizing everything that could either help or hinder us during our journey. The more I stared into the distance, the more I realized that we were still a far cry from California, and the daunting possibility of never making it there began to take shape in my mind as I trudged down the slope to camp. It seemed like we had at least a month of grueling travel ahead of us before we could even hope to strike gold, and our supplies and energy were scarce for such a great endeavor. I was so preoccupied with this thought that I hardly even considered the risk of encountering Native Americans, even as I walked alone and vulnerable. Instead, my mind drifted to the abundance of food waiting for me back home, including my dad's hearty meals, And here I was, the eldest son, starving and parched in the middle of the vast American desert, with clothes that were wearing away from constant use. And worst of all, I knew that things could get even bleaker. I might have to witness my companions, both men and women, young and old, perish before my helpless eyes. It was a day darker and more despairing than any I had ever known before, and I wept openly, for I could see the future, and it was nothing but bitter disappointment. I pray that no one who reads my account will ever find themselves in such a dire position, for I have to confess that under such conditions I am prone to weakness. I cannot describe the agony and isolation of my lonely journeys, sometimes lasting days and nights on end, as I tried to lead my party to safety. Though I knew I could escape any time I wished, I was bound by the determination to save everyone, even if it meant giving them the worst news. But I also knew that I needed to keep my worst fears to myself, so that I would not derail their spirits or hope. I arrived at the camp on the third day, where I found the boys who had accompanied me for part of the way, but whom I had outpaced. I wasted no time in recounting to the entire camp the sights I had seen on my journey. When I had finished, they informed me of a stash of squashes that they had come across, which would be ample sustenance for the entire group. However, I was not in favor of such a plan because we had no right to take what did not belong to us. We could easily be retaliated against by the true owners of the squash. They were unaware of the potential danger of angering the indigenous people and needed to be cautioned. Whilst I was absent, a decision had been made to slaughter one of our oxen, as we were dangerously low on food. The meat was divvied up evenly amongst everyone, with the agreement that when necessary, future slaughters would be done in the same way. One of the wagons had to be abandoned because there were too few animals left to pull it, and our beasts were in such feeble condition that one would not provide sustenance for very long. The entire carcass was devoid of any fat, and its marrow was a putrid fluid, streaked with blood resembling corruption. Our travels took us around the base of the mountain, where we encountered countless obstructions, many of them as massive as a house. Despite this, we managed to navigate through our winding path. Our oxen's feet were so tender by now that we crafted makeshift moccasins for them from the newly killed animal's hide, which greatly assisted in the animal's mobility. Our convoy was now comprised of 7 wagons belonging to Bennett, 2, Arcane, 2, Earhart Brothers, 1, Culverwell, Fish, and others, 1, and one more whose ownership eludes me. We made camp on the second night with favorable grass and brush for the oxen, but were not far from the snow line, which was impacting the terrain. When Bennett turned in for the night, he set a camp kettle brimming with fresh beef on the fire so it could simmer away and be ready for breakfast at first light. After about an hour, Mr. Bennett went out to check on the meat and stoke the fire. But when I later went to add more water, we realized that most of the meat had vanished. I was curled up in a cozy little nest beneath Bennett's wagon when he returned, and I saw him scanning the surroundings as if seeking the culprit. Eventually, he sidled up to me and whispered, "Did you see anyone around the fire after we went to bed?" I assured him that I hadn't, and he confided that his meat had been stolen. "Do you reckon," he muttered, "that someone's so desperate for food that they're on the brink of starvation?" "Well," I replied, "the meat wasn't exactly top-notch, so whoever took it must be pretty hard up." After a few more hushed words, we went back to sleep. But come dawn, we kept a vigilant eye on anyone who stirred around the camp. We were pretty sure we knew who the culprit was, but we couldn't be certain, and we dreaded the prospect of food thievery becoming a regular occurrence. You see, in groups like ours, it's an unspoken rule that anyone caught pilfering provisions is risking their neck, so we resolved to stay alert, and if anyone were caught stealing again, they'd be held accountable no matter what. Bennett stayed on high alert while I stuck close to the wagons for the next few days. It was the most precarious moment of our journey, but after a few days had passed, we gave up hope of catching the thief and breathed a sigh of relief that the crisis had passed without incident. Chapter 7. Peril and Distress. One moonlit evening our camp was a beautiful sight, huddled close to the base of the snow butte. We discovered a hole nestled among the rocks, brimming with what appeared to be pure, living water. In that crystal-clear aqua were a smattering of minnows, tiny fish no more than an inch long. The oxen delighted in finding grass sprouting in and around the rocks, merrily munching away. Our fortune was short-lived, unfortunately, as we quickly realized that the only outlet to the great plain in front of us lay to the south. This meant trekking across a harsh wasteland which led to the base of the Black Mountains looming in the distance. And even beyond those mountains rose the lofty snowy peak, with Martin's Pass over it, our eventual destination, yet still far off despite weeks of travel toward it. The cruel truth was that we had to forge a path westward, and those imposing Black Mountains obstructed our path completely. If we could not find a pass through them, we'd be compelled to push southward and make no progress toward Martin's Pass. Our path led us gradually to the valley floor, the narrowest and flattest we'd traversed. It was the same valley where the Jayhawkers had started before us, farther north and 10 days prior. As fate would have it, we came across a small but lively stream that must have come from far-off mountains that lay approximately 100 miles to the north. Dead grasses were evident everywhere, a sure sign that water flow was rare and only occurred after heavy rainfall. Unfortunately, the water in the stream was less than fresh. It had a distasteful and bitter tang, and could cause harm if imbibed regularly during dry months. Anyone who sipped from it was left feeling as if they had consumed a hearty dose of salts. A short ways up ahead, we stumbled upon the tracks of the Jayhawkers heading out west, and from this I gathered that they had ventured safely across the vast plain, then veered southward. Without further ado, I hustled after their trail for quite a distance, using my trusty field glass to scan the landscape for any signs of water. Sadly, my efforts were to no avail, as I soon realized that the only way to quench our thirst was to make it to the summit of the next range. A surge of anxiety crept into my bones as I entertained the possibility that the party had neglected to pack enough water for the entire journey. So I rushed back to them and discovered to my utter dismay that they had come up dry. I sternly informed them that for the next 40 miles we would remain parched as the desert sand, and in a bid to ameliorate our predicament, the lightest wagon was offloaded to carry any containers or vessels which would hold water that we could scrape up. Revitalized and resolute, I retraced my steps along the Jayhawkers' path, moving at a brisk pace until just before twilight I found myself nearing the summit. A notch in the rocky ridge was found, and as I steadfastly battled my way up, it struck me that not a single tree, shrub, or blade of grass could be found for miles on end. Indeed, desolation had encroached upon this forsaken area in a manner beyond reckoning. Throughout our trek I always carried my trusty gun by my side, yet the abundant game that had befittingly flitted about the terrain seemed to be shifting out of sight. Even the faintest chirp of the birds, ruffling of the feathers of a hawk, or the frantic flapping of a crow was a distant memory. As I approached the steepest part of the mountain, my eyes caught sight of a dead ox that the Jayhawkers had left, most likely due to the paucity of water and grass. The carcass of the animal had badly shriveled, but to my surprise it was still in a nearly pristine condition, unmarred by decay. A large chunk had been hacked off from the hind leg, right through to the bone, and the sun had done a mighty fine job of roasting the flesh to a crisp. Hunger seized me to an unbearable degree, and with my trusty sheath knife I sliced off a sizable steak and devoured it right there on the spot with nary a smidgen of salt or the warmth of fire to cook it. Some may argue that they would rather go hungry than partake of such a repulsive and unsavory chunk of meat. But for those who have confronted starvation until it threatens to sap the life from within them, the desire for self-preservation becomes an irresistible urge that overrides all sense of judgment. Indeed, it is an instinct that stealthily takes hold of one without their knowledge or consent. I journeyed through a narrow and dark canyon with towering walls that seemed to reach the sky. The walls stood perpendicular, with some parts variegated clay formations and streams of water flowing down their faces. The indigenous people had crafted a bowl out of clay and fixed it to the wall to catch the water, which I gratefully drank. My thirst was quenched, and I stayed the night nearby for fear of Indian attacks. I slept without a fire, and the meat I had hunted filled my stomach. In the morning I continued my descent, the canyon deepening rapidly and the rocky terrain sharp and volcanic. I spotted some Indian tracks and remained vigilant, keeping a watchful eye on my surroundings, fearing for the stolen squashes. Though danger was ever present, I pressed onwards, trusting in my luck and intuition. If my memory serves me right, it was Christmas Day, and as the sun began to set, I discovered a campsite occupied by Reverend J.W. Breyer, his wife, and their 2 sons. I inquired about the others in their party, and he informed me they were ahead. It struck me as peculiar how the Reverend was lecturing his children on the significance of education, given the dire circumstances we found ourselves in. Starvation loomed, and the barren land around us held no promise of anything but the basic instincts of survival. We were lost in more ways than one. Geographically, we had no idea where we were, nor when our journey would reach its destination. Our dwindling provisions were a constant reminder of our predicament. Some had no choice but to rely on the oxen as their sole source of sustenance. It was a dire situation, and nobody knew when we'd receive relief. That night I slept by the fire without a blanket, like I had so many other nights. It was a small comfort, but it was all I had. Come morning I scoured the camp and found some discarded bacon rinds. As I savored the rich grease within them, I couldn't remember the last time I tasted something so sweet. To the north of our location there were some rolling hills and weak springs. These springs trickled down into a small stream that flowed for just a few yards before blending into the surrounding rocks and sand. On one side I noticed what appeared to be half a butte, towering with a steep face facing the canyon. And up at the summit of the butte I spotted a figure, an Indian, so small and distant he was no larger than my finger. In my gut I sensed that he might be the same Indian who had grown the squashes we'd seen earlier. But I couldn't be certain. Chapter 8. A Living Mummy. I turned back to find the wagons, which had traveled 7 or 8 miles up the canyon. Despite the downhill slope, the oxen were struggling to move slowly, as the wagons were mostly empty except for the women and children. As night fell, the cloudy sky was accompanied by the distant cries of wild geese flying past us towards the east. We took this as a good omen and figured we were getting closer to Owens Lake, which lay ahead on our route. Over in the small hills and moist areas we found coarse grass and other plants, but the previous travelers had already taken the best of the vegetation, leaving little for our oxen to feed on. The following morning I shouldered my gun and walked down the canyon along the wagon road. About half a mile through the sickly stream I saw a wild goose and shot it. No doubt it had been drawn to our campfire the night before. As I moved further down the canyon I saw a cliff rising on the right-hand side, with a cave at the base that looked like it was occupied by Indians. Continuing down I saw an unusual-looking trail on the ground. It appeared as if a human had crawled on all fours. As the trail led to the valley where the wind had swept the sand clean, the tracks became more prominent, with the sand blown into small hills up to 3 or 4 feet high. Following these tracks, I saw it led to the top of one of these small hills. There was a well-like hole on the top, and inside it was an Indian mummy in a curled-up position like a dog. He was alive, as I could see him breathing, but his skin was dry and looked like that of a well-dried venison ham. He appeared to be 200 or 300 years old, giving the impression that he could be Adam's brother, without looking any older than Adam. He was clearly crippled, but had somehow managed to survive for an unknown length of time. A climate that could preserve the meat of an ox for days or weeks might possibly preserve a live man for much longer than we assumed. I gazed intently at the untamed beast in front of me. It remained perfectly still, as if aware of my presence, yet refusing to acknowledge it. Its actions were reminiscent of a seasoned politician, silently observing their surroundings, caution ingrained into their every move. It was clear that no amount of talking would get this creature into trouble. It had clearly mastered the art of strategic silence. This creature must have had a confidant somewhere, someone to fulfill its needs. I left it to its devices and proceeded deeper into the valley. Looking northwards, I could see for miles, the land gradually rising before me. A quick glance towards the south revealed an equally expansive view, with a lake visible in the distance. The valley, though narrow at this point, was filled with lofty, snow-capped peaks, including the one we had struggled to reach for nearly 2 months. It loomed over me, its eastern side virtually perpendicular, reaching up towards the sky. Snow drifted over it like a white blanket, while the sun beat down mercilessly upon me. I believed this peak to be miles high, with no other creature capable of climbing it except perhaps a bird, and the only avian inhabitant I had come across lately was the goose I had managed to shoot. I scoured the landscape daily, hoping to spot some other form of sustenance, but to no avail. As I made my way to the valley floor, I trod on an assortment of rocks which grew in size as I walked. They appeared to be covered in dirt at first, but on closer inspection were revealed to be massive blocks of rock salt. The water which pooled at their bases was intensely saline. After this discovery, I retraced my steps, following the path left behind by the jayhawkers. The path was fairly even, but sandy. Soon after nightfall, I came upon a campfire where E. Doty and his companions were camping. As I knew them, I decided to stop over with them. They warned me about the brackish water, and I discovered they were right. It was a dismal campsite. No grass, poor water, and bitter sagebrush, which was the only food available for the cattle. It was not a place to linger, and they hastened on. I asked the group about Martin's Pass, now within their reach. Their response left no room for doubt. It was no pass at all, only a slightly lower mountain than the snow-covered one next to it. They explained that no wagon could cross it, and that they had resolved to continue on foot. They had even resorted to burning their wagons as fuel to dry out the meat from the weak oxen they had culled for food. Each member of the party would receive equal portions of the rations. It was agreed that everyone was on their own and could not expect assistance from others. Any individual who depleted their portion would receive no help from the rest. Rice, tea, and coffee were measured out by the spoonful, and the remaining flour and bacon were shared out as evenly as possible. Only blankets and the bare minimum provisions would be carried. The men were too frail to bear heavy loads, and the oxen were not reliable enough as beasts of burden. It was decided not to overburden them and risk losing them. Initially, these men were full of life and merriment, finding joy along the Platte River. But now they were despondent and whispered in low tones. One among them even referred to this place as a junkyard of sorts, where the Creator had dumped all the undesirables after creating the world. Another claimed it was the same site where Lot's wife was turned into a pillar of salt, and that the fragmented remnants had spread throughout the land. In this bleak mood, they shared some of their slightly better meat with me before I headed back along the trail before dawn. The purpose of my journey was to relay the concerning reports I had received about the jayhawkers. Around midday, I stumbled upon two fellow members of our camp as they trudged along the arduous wagon trail. These two were ripe with age, looking to be about 50 years old each. The first man hailed from the great state of Indiana, known as Mr. Fish, while the other held a less memorable name, Gould. As they jostled their weighted packs on their backs, we briefly exchanged pleasantries. The two old bears bemoaned the prospect of following behind the sluggish oxen teams and confessed they could perhaps fare better making the trek on foot. But once I informed them of the journey's demands and the unforgiving terrain ahead, they seemed uncertain. After all, the meager contents of their packs would need replenishing, a feat impossible in our current predicament. They were also convinced I was exaggerating the distance remaining, not ready to accept just how far we still had to go. Mr. Fish wore a long, sturdy whiplash tightly coiled around his waist, an oddity I couldn't resist asking about. He replied that perhaps he could barter it for sustenance along the way, demonstrating his shrewdness in the face of adversity. We paused for a spell amidst a hilly expanse of sand, chatting idly and sharing provisions. As we prepared to part ways, our handshakes felt strained, and our parting words reverberated with angst. A premonition of sorts struck me, a nagging sense that I would never set eyes on these two middle-aged comrades again. As I strode away from the mountain range, embarking upon a firmer, level path, my thoughts grew increasingly clouded. I pondered the complicated and perilous situation we were in, considering the unimaginable consequences. If perchance I were on this journey alone, there would be no hesitation. I would be the first to emerge victorious. But as fate would have it, my duty was to safeguard the women and children in our party. Deserting them now would condemn my soul to everlasting shame, a price far too high to pay. I understood that the better course of action would be to suffer through to the bitter end, even if it meant facing death alongside them. To stand by their side as they fiercely fought to survive was a feat of courage and nobility, the only honorable path forward. As the sun began to set, I stumbled upon our camp. We were all gathered around the fire, trying to keep warm and comforted by its embrace. It was then that I broke the unfavorable news of the party in advance, telling them in the most easy way possible. Despite our misfortune, they looked at me with trust and respect. I had become their guide and adviser, taking great pains to inform myself on every detail. My judgment was accepted with little opposing opinion, and they moved as I thought best. While I was away, the Indians had launched arrows into 3 of our oxen. One still had an arrow in its side, forward of the hip, a dangerous place. To save it for ourselves, we killed the animal. Some were scared to eat the meat, thinking it could be poisoned. But I reassured them that if they themselves were shot with an arrow, it would most likely be poisoned. They must take immediate measures to cut it out before it went into their blood. To be safe, we dried the meat and took it with us. I then addressed the entire camp. You can see how you have displeased the red men taking their little squashes. When we get into a place that suits them for that purpose, they may meet us with a superior force and massacre us, not only for revenge, but to get our oxen and clothing. We must always be on guard against a surprise, as the chances were greatly against us. We pulled out the arrows from the other oxen, and they seemed to sustain no great injury from the wounds. This little faint stream where we camped has since been named Furnace Creek, and is still known as such. In 1862, some prospectors built an air furnace on a small scale to reduce some ore found nearby. They believed it contained silver, but it turned out to be lead and too far from transportation to be useful. Chapter 9. Peril and Distress at Every Turn. Bennett and Arcane were done waiting for me. I had scouted out a path for them to follow for some time, but they had decided it was best to forge ahead on their own. They hitched up their wagons and headed south towards the water and passes we so desperately needed. As we made our way on this new course, we quickly realized we'd have to cross the valley and make our way to the west side. The only thing between us and our destination was water. I feared the ground might be muddy and treacherous, so I went looking for a sturdy stick to sound out our way. Armed with my trusty mesquite stick, I waded into the water, my pants rolled up and my moccasins tossed aside. I had the teams wait while I tested the water's depth and the strength of the ground beneath it. Though the water was very clear, the bottom was uneven, and there were deep holes to avoid. When I struck my stick on the ground, it felt like solid rock. Breaking off a small piece, I discovered it was salt. The teams rolled on, barely disturbing the water. It was as if we were traveling on a bed of salt stretching for miles in every direction. We even passed solid blocks of salt covered in a thin layer of dirt. On our second night, we found a spring of fresh water. It was a small flow coming out of the snow peak above us, but it spread out over the sand, providing much-needed moisture for the surrounding grass. We had finally found what we were looking for, and we all felt a sense of relief wash over us.